Welcome back to Heights Cast, the podcast of the Heights School. This is Rich Moss with you from the campus of the Heights in Potomac, Maryland. We are here to talk about the education and the formation of young men fully alive in the liberal arts tradition. Thanks so much for listening. And thank you for continuing to share our mission and our vision of education with your friends. We're very, very grateful. This week, we welcome Dr. Matthew Tapie, the author, and Dr. Lionel Yaceczko, the Latin translator of a new book titled The Mortara Case and Thomas Aquinas' Defense of Jewish Parental Authority. This book was released by the Catholic University of America Press just last week. So again, another great book, hot off the press. We're going to be talking about the Mortara Case, a difficult moment in Jewish Christian history in which the theology of Thomas Aquinas was brought into court by the Jewish defendants to argue that parental authority is an inviolable result of natural law. It's a fascinating case with a lot of plot twists, but Matthew and Lionel will walk us through it all alongside St. Thomas and talk a little bit about why this case resurfaces today. I think we're especially interested in this concept of parental authority, and it's good to, here at the school, we believe parents are the primary educators. I think this conversation within a very difficult historical context helps us understand more about the parent as primary educator. Dr. Matthew Tapie is an associate professor of theology at St. Leo University in Florida, where he's also the director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. He has many advisory roles in the space of Catholic-Jewish dialogue, including on the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee for Dialogue with Modern Orthodox Judaism and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. Our friend, Dr. Lionel Yaceczko, has been a serial contributor to the forum. Blessed to have him there, having been a Heights faculty member for 8 years, teaching Latin and, in fact, authoring an introductory Latin textbook before accepting a position at Benedictine College in Kansas as an assistant professor of classics. He provided the Latin translations for Dr. Tapie's book and also made the introduction for us to host them both today on this podcast. So thank you, Lionel. Thanks to both of today's guests. We hope you enjoy this episode. Dr. Tapie, Dr. Yaceczko, thank you so much for joining us on Heightscast. Really appreciate your time.
Hi, Rich. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure, and congratulations to you both. Dr. Tapie, especially the named author here on the new book, The Mortara Case, and Thomas Aquinas' Defense of Jewish Parental Authority. Something that I knew very little about. Actually, no, I didn't know anything about it until you sent me this book. And it's really, really interesting because especially at this time when we are trying to, there's just a lot of conversation in the United States and in Europe as well about the rights of parents with regard to the education of their children. And of course, the role of parents vis-a-vis the state. But then to think about this in the context of, okay, just the rights of parents, also in relation to the state, and by the way, the church, that's kind of another factor in this interesting mix. So, a very interesting place and context to study an issue that I think is very alive today. So this book treats of essentially the Mortara case, or the Mortara case, I guess it would be with proper pronunciation.
Nice Italian.
Grazie. But it's a very controversial moment in history, and perhaps Dr. Tapie, Matthew, please just walk us through the case. What is it? Because my bet is that 90% of listeners are not familiar with it. So just give us a quick rundown, if you don't mind, of the facts of the case.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, most people will not know of the Mortara case. It's a case that happened in 1858 under Pope Pius IX in Bologna, Italy. It's an open wound, really, for Catholic-Jewish relations. For some of the listeners, Catholic-Jewish relations may be kind of a foreign topic, but that's one way to locate this story, especially for those who are interested in classical education and who happen to be maybe from a Catholic background. This year is the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, which is the declaration from the Second Vatican Council that positively reframes Jewish-Christian relations. It kind of casts it in a positive light and defines the relationship in a positive way. And, I'd probably start there because it actually helps people to think about it in terms of, there's a historical relationship that the Vatican in the Second Vatican Council sought to try to treat and mend. And that was a negative relationship with Jews. And they tried to treat that in a positive way at the Second Vatican Council. And for instance, do things like condemn anti-Semitism and call for Catholics to be interested in, in working toward dialogue with their Jewish neighbors. So because of this positive framework, when we look back in this era and we see this case, for the Catholic community, it's something that it pains us because really when we look back at and we see a difficult situation of what is ultimately a child custody dispute. And it does bring up the question of rights, as you mentioned, of parental rights and education. But at this time, in 1858, the ecclesiastical and political powers of the time were very different from ours. This is the time of the Papal States. And so at this time, the Pope is more of kind of like a monarch or a king. And there's a temporal power there that's administered and adjudicated, throughout much of Italy, really. And this includes oversight of all communities that would be living in Italy, including the Jewish community. And the facts of the case kind of start there with that backdrop, that political backdrop of church, administering both temporal and also spiritual power. Religious education was very important. Part of the ecclesiastical laws of the time, which were then also enforced by political structures that would be overseen by the Papal States. Part of the rules and the laws there at that time was that the education of all Christians is of utmost priority. And so if someone were baptized Catholic, then it was the law that they would receive an education as a Christian. This is where the case sort of kind of gets off the ground, really. There was a baptism of Edgardo Mortara, who is the child of the Jewish family who was living in Bologna in 1858. And he was baptized by his Christian housekeeper, his maidservant, who had thought he was ill. And in fact, thought he was so ill that he was near death, and so baptized him at that time. The ecclesiastical.
Just to throw this in there, he's 6 years old at the time, right?
Yes, he's 6 years. Well, no, actually, he is 6 years old, Lionel, at the removal. Because of the law for education that all children must be educated. Edgardo would be removed when he was 6 years late. 6 years later, when he was 6 years old, he was removed because then the story had gotten out that he was baptized as a child. So basically, in 1858 is the date of the removal in June, but the baptism had happened years earlier when Edgardo was just an infant. This baptism is also disputed as well because the family doctors would then dispute this and say that he was not near death. But this near death question becomes important because the ecclesiastical laws that stipulated that someone could be baptized against the will of their parents in order to save them was if they were dying. And so there was this law that was there and present and active. This is the sort of the loophole that sort of created the situation where Edgardo would then be removed. He was transported to Rome. He was taken under the care of Pius IX directly and was educated as a Christian boy, having been baptized. This caused an immediate difficulty for, of course, the parents, and the book discusses the facts of the case in much greater detail, based on the archival resources that are available in Bologna, and then also in the Vatican archives. And the reason why it's important to look at the case, I think, and to see, to look into it and to learn about it, is that ultimately it does come down to this question of parental rights. and whether or not even the non-Christians among us are included in this group that we would say, yes, parental rights is a natural right. All people should have the right to educate their children. And so this conflict sort of, it's really, is one way to think of it as a conflict between the church and the Jewish community at this time. The Jewish community submitted documents requesting for the child to be returned. The Vatican replied to those requests and denied them. And this is where Lionel and I's work was a collaboration. Lionel and I worked together because we had handwritten manuscripts from the Vatican archives where we were dealing with a document from the family that requested the return of the child, and Lionel's work in translating those handwritten manuscripts was tremendous. If it wasn't for Lionel and myself collaborating in this work, working together, then it wouldn't have come to fruition. But this book contains the actual documents of the family requesting the return of the child and the Vatican reply. And this is the first time these documents have been published in English, transcribed, translated, and published in English.
It's amazing. What Lionel, as you were translating, was there any aspect of the facts of the case? And pardon my legal background. Sometimes I'll hope I don't sound too lawyery, but were there any facts that or any sort of insights as you were translating that sort of surprised you? And maybe another question within that one is what does this say about working with original language texts rather than perhaps translation?
Yeah, well, as far as the facts of the case, the really compelling and suspenseful story of the police coming to the door of the Mortara family's house in Bologna and the Jewish ghetto, and his father asking if he can just have just a little bit of time to go and talk to the judge, and he walks across town and all of that stuff. I'm getting from Matthew. The stuff that's coming out of the document that I'm working with is legalese, right? It's a document that's produced by lawyers, right? And so what is it about working with it in the original language that makes it? Well, it's loaded with Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas is. I mean, we think of him as a theologian, and he is. But he's a philosopher, and in the broad sense of the word, and philosophy, I think, is just always easier to understand in the original language than it is in translation. I think Thomas has a sort of highly stylized way of communicating that lends itself more toward being understood in translation. He's got a clarity that a lot of philosophers generally speaking, don't have to such a high degree. But also just the thrill of working with a handwritten document. You feel much closer to the person because, Rich, you're a teacher. You've graded a lot of handwritten things. The character of the person that's written the thing comes. You feel closer to the person when you're grading a handwritten assignment. A student forgets to write his name at the top of a page, and you still know whose quiz it is because you've come to recognize that handwriting, and that's just something that I've loved over the years as a teacher, and in getting to know my students is just instantly knowing whose paper I'm looking at by the handwriting. So when I'm looking at this document, there's little idiosyncrasies that this person has left behind. These parts are difficult. These parts are these ligatures and these abbreviations. But then you also start to notice little things when you're reading in the original that you don't notice when you get in a translation, like the significance of a given word because of its frequency. There's this phrase that comes up in the Mortara case a lot, invitis parentibus, and Matthew generally leaves it in the Latin in the book because it becomes a term that we just need to be able to handle in it as a technical term, right? So it means literally in Latin, with the parents unwilling, or against the will of the parents, you might say. So that would be one specific example of a phrase that you really start to notice the importance of quickly, because it keeps coming up. You see, this is what the case is about.
That has a real significance, Lionel. If you don't mind me commenting, Rich, is it okay if I jump in here?
Yes, please, Matthew.
The document that Lionel's describing is a two-part document, and it's submitted by the Jewish community of Rome on behalf of the Mortara family. And so when this incident happens in Bologna, the Roman Jewish community responds because they have the resources to do so. They are familiar with these cases. This Mortara case was not the only case in which a child was removed from their parents after a clandestine baptism, without their knowledge. It happened to, several times, unfortunately. This is one of the reasons why I became more interested in the case, because I found that in the Mortara case, this was not the only time that the Jewish families were appealing to Thomas Aquinas' defense of Jewish parental rights in order to advocate for the return of their children. It had occurred in a few other cases as well. And that struck me as, wow, here you have the Jewish community relying upon Thomas Aquinas' philosophy to try to defend themselves from what I argue in the book, according to Thomas's concerns, according to Thomas's theology, is a grave injustice against the natural rights of parents. So the Jewish community would likely have worked with a Catholic lawyer, but anonymously. The Catholic lawyer would have represented the Jewish community. So the document actually has no real named author other than it's the Mortara family, submitting the documents. And so Lionel's intimacy with this document, with this handwritten manuscript, is really interesting because it's a product really of the most ancient Jewish community in the world is the Roman one.
It's amazing. And I just, you can't help but, as you're hearing this story, an infant baptized, taken away from his family at the age of 6, and the father hustling across town, to try to get in front of a judge to put a stop to this. You feel it. Your stomach kind of turns a little bit because you just feel the pain of this family. And you hear horror stories in a more contemporary setting of things that are similar. But the tough thing is that one of the main protagonists in this case is the church. And so as, personally as a Catholic Christian, as a Catholic, as you're assessing the course of action chosen by the church, what's the frame? How do you view, how do you assess, how do you analyze the church, which on one hand is the it's got this beautiful pastoral function. We like to think of the church as as a mother in some respects, but then this mistake, my goodness. So how do we relate to the story? How do we relate to the church in light of all that?
Thank you. It's a difficult question, really. It has to do a lot with things we hold dear and things that are part of our identity, right? As I speak from a Catholic perspective, as a Catholic theologian, the church is human, but it's also divine. The church is divine in its sacraments. It has human leaders. It has human people that guide it. And sometimes we make mistakes. Having, I think, a sense of humility and a realism about the history of the church is very helpful. Not one that's a secular notion, but I think a theological understanding of that is important. And the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith actually gives a lot of guidance on this question. There is a document that was published under the guidance of Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, that was called Memory and Reconciliation. And I discussed this document at the beginning of the book and mentioned basically that this document guides Catholics toward looking at history with a positive attitude and one that's not afraid of the truth of history. There are difficult times in the history of the church, and perhaps there are some of the most difficult of those times between Jews and Christians. Jews as a minority group in the past suffered at times, not always, but we don't want to describe it as a lachrymose history of the Jewish people, but in Europe, under Christian rule, sometimes there were, Christian princes who were not Christian toward our Jewish neighbors. And this legacy is difficult. Both Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI himself referred to it as a difficult history. And John Paul II is cited in this document. John Paul II said that Christians must turn toward history and not be afraid of the truth that emerges from that history. I categorize this under the virtue of prudence. As someone who is a Catholic theologian trained in some of the moral theology of the church, the virtue of prudence, as you know, one of the four cardinal virtues is the steady disposition to grasp reality around us and act accordingly. And if we're going to grasp reality around us, it would seem that we would want to know the truth about our history, about our story, in the same way perhaps that a Catholic has to be very mindful of our own personal history when we go to confession. We examine our conscience and we ask, how have I been doing? What is my reality? And that's what we do here in this case. I think we look at the reality based on the archival documents, and we strive to just analyze those according to the truth of what happened, but then also bring in the moral and theological evaluation as well, because there's a religious dimension to this case. And that's what this book really examines. For the first time, it brings a religious theological lens to one of the most difficult cases in Catholic-Jewish relations and really in Christian-Jewish relations. And at the heart of it is this question about the natural rights of parents, which I argue are God-given natural rights, that these are things that cannot be taken away according to the natural law. These are things that the church has always strived to honor, and yet these cases did emerge toward the end of the 1700s and the 1800s, where the parental rights of the minority communities in Rome and other places in the Papal States were eroded a bit.
Yeah, so it's fascinating to see just like you just said, the interplay of kind of the legal framework. A lot of if then, if this happens and that happens, how that relates with the philosophy. But then, of course, all of this is really drawing deeply. Even the legal side of things seems to be pulling from the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is fascinating. You like to think of, gosh, just put yourself in a modern court case in the United States, and they're citing Blackstone, and they're citing the restatements and whatever other case, and also St. Thomas Aquinas says X, Y, Z. It's kind of a remarkable thing to ponder.
Even Rich, I would add even a modern canon law case, because I've done some translation jobs for canon lawyers where they're working through whether to declare nullity, right? So an annulment case, and it's a lot more about the facts and a lot less about Thomas, right? There's not a whole lot of Thomas even in those cases.
It's so interesting, and just one wonders, maybe a podcast for a future occasion. But if there is more of an appeal to things like natural law, natural rights, these sorts of things in our own tradition, what is a place of the angelic doctor in those conversations and discussions? But here we kind of focus. Your book focuses on the theological side of this case. And I'd love to just go deeper there. How do you think? I mean, how does appealing to Thomas Aquinas in this context? Does he reframe the idea of rights, kind of out of this legal type context where you sort of have what you're given by the state, reframing that into a theological context? What does Thomas Aquinas add, and how does that change the discussion?
That's a really great question, because when we hear the word rights and we think natural rights today, we tend to think of something that's quite perhaps sprawling and located within some account of nature that everybody can agree to. And Thomas does not have a theory of natural rights. He does, though, however, use the arguments of defending certain rights as natural, but he understands them as God-given. He understands them as part of a nature that it constitutes all human persons. and is kind of a multifaceted kind of construct that includes a philosophical orientation to the truth, to truth and goodness, and the way in which human beings are inclined toward God, even perhaps without even really knowing it, that they seek the truth and they seek goodness by nature, and that these things represent the image of God in them. From Thomas's perspective, it's a certain level of natural justice is established in the universe. God governs the created order by providing people with certain rights, and he ties this all to the natural law as well. Another big word here. So for Thomas, there's like theological notions here operating that would ground these notion of rights in the idea that we would use the language of maybe God-given, that they were inscribed by God, and why? So that, for instance, a community ensures that parents have oversight over their children, and that this is part of the way God intended for the world to be governed by natural law, and it's something that's true for all people, regardless of whether they believe explicitly in Christianity or not. It's just something that God has set up to govern the order. So that's a theological picture of how Thomas thinks. But on this particular question on baptism of children against the will of the parents or without their knowledge of, Thomas answers quite strongly and clearly in his Summa Theologiae on this question, and he says, the church has it's never been the custom of the church that non-Christian children be baptized against the will of their parents. We've never taught that, is how he starts out his answer. And he answers this question 3 different times in his corpus. So in 3 different times in his works, he addresses this question. Why? Because it had become a question that people were speculating about. It had not become a practice at that point in the 13th century. For those who are listening, Thomas, was a 13th century theologian. But the question of, it seems perhaps a way to persuade non-Christians to join Christianity would be to perhaps baptize the children. And there were creative answers, kind of, because that's one of the most effective ways to make a Christian. You don't have to persuade you or convince, or you can just baptize them. So it was a point in which the Jewish-Christian relationship is also part of the story. And there were some negative elements that were going on there, where some of the Christian authorities had learned that, for instance, Judaism of that day was Judaism that is a rabbinic Judaism, and it's tied to the Talmud. And the Christian discovery of the Talmud was part of this backdrop in Thomas's time, where there was less confidence that the Jewish community would convert to Christianity, and many Christians at this time were very interested in that, and they thought that would be something that would be, very, very important for the church. So there's a whole another historical world here that we're looking at that is in the background. It's very different from our world, but it's a world where this question became very important. Thomas shoots it down 3 different times, saying this is a bad idea. And that God intends for children to come to faith in God through their parents, and makes that argument based on not only the custom of the church logic, but he also makes the argument based on the natural rights law, and argues on the natural law that this is something that God inscribes in nature, and that we're protected against. The children belong to their parents. He says almost like a spiritual womb. He uses the analogy of the spiritual womb. He says when a child is in the womb, by nature, it's attached to the parents. But then guess what? Even after the child is born, the child is still part of the parents in a spiritualis uterus. And the spiritual uterus or spiritual womb is a place where children are cultivated and cared for. And so it's actually quite a powerful metaphor for Thomas to use that metaphor for Jewish care for their parents. Means that, boy, he really has a very high view of what parents do for children when they are young and dependent on their parents for all sorts of spiritual and physical help.
That's awesome. I'll use that at some point if I'm talking to a student that's complaining about a parental decision. I'll say, listen, man, you're still in the spiritual womb. Got to have respect.
Well, I think it cuts both. I think for Thomas, it would cut both ways, though, because then the parent is also called to be a virtuous parent, right?
Yes,
and the parent has to cannot prescribe unjust laws for the community.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That is the domestic church or the family, whatever, So it's interesting how Thomas's virtue theory wouldn't let the parents just kind of run around with a tyrannical sort of like, I said so.
Right, because they have to be themselves rooted in this natural, this order, this law of God they're called into.
Exactly. That's especially cultivated by the theological virtues as well, of faith, hope, and love, then feeds all of that, so that any just rules that you prescribe for your fairness of rules for your family are guided by all the virtues, including charity, patience, and humility, and all that good stuff. Yeah.
There's also a positive, I think, incitement to virtue for a parent to think of him or herself as holding the child in a spiritual womb. That I was thinking about as you were talking, right? That when I saw my own wife become pregnant with our first child, like that was a dramatic moment of, now all of a sudden she's got this higher, greater motivation than she's ever had before to think about what she eats, right? And what her blood pressure is, and right, we're going to the midwife's office every month or whatever, and finding out about this and that. It's just all that, I think, can transfer metaphorically for the things that we're talking about with the spiritual womb.
Yeah, no doubt. It's interesting. Yeah, I talked to a friend of yours, Lionel, Tom Steenson, in a previous episode, and he was encouraging parents to really just more and more trust their instincts. It's so easy to sort of, second guess yourself, and especially when your decisions might be unpopular on the home front. But perhaps this is an image that's going to help people through some of those moments of indecision. And I promise this is not like a Secret Heights promo, but I think, Lionel, you've this in a previous life, this place was a home. I think it still continues to be that in some way, but you're doing God's work elsewhere. But you've experienced it firsthand as a teacher and as a parent, and I think this is an awesome opportunity to think about why certain things that we say here all the time are true on a deeper level. So one of the things you hear constantly at the Heights is that parents are primary educators. So how has this, your study of these documents and these translations of these facts, how does this deepen or perhaps reframe in some way your understanding of that phrase as you use it when you're at the Heights? Lionel, parents, primary educators, say that constantly because it's true. But how has this experience deepened or changed or refined that understanding?
Yeah. Parents as primary educators of the children, right? When you're an educator of children and when you're addressing parents, you want to make sure that they understand what you perceive your role to be as you come into their family life. And so that there's a clear mutual understanding of what your role is and what their role is and what the boys' role is in the case of the Heights, an all-boys school. And there's a lesson, I think, that comes from just the nature of translation itself, which is, as a translator, you want to help the author come into direct contact as closely as possible with the audience by speaking to the audience in their idiom, but in a way that if the author could somehow be present today, he or she could say, yeah, that's what I meant. If he or she could learn the idiom of your audience, he or she could say, yeah, that's what I would have said if I if I had known their language back then. And I think as educators of boys, that's what we want to do as well. We want the boys constantly to be hearing echoes when they're in the classroom of their parents, and when they're at home, echoes of what their teachers are saying. And that's what we're trying to do as a translator. We're trying to bring that, make a seamless link between all parties, right? What we want to try to avoid is becoming too much, having too pronounced a presence ourselves as translators. While at the same time, when you do produce a translation, it can't be like that. That doesn't mean that if it's as mechanical as possible, then you've disappeared as much as possible as a translator, and you've achieved the goal. Because the problem there is that when it's as mechanical as possible, you're going to be misrepresenting the author a lot of the time, and you're also going to be producing something that is dead. And it's hard to say exactly what I mean by that, but I see this a lot when I teach classes, great books classes, and the students are reading a lot of ancient texts from ancient languages like Latin and ancient Greek that have been translated. And sometimes they'll say, wow, that's a really good translation. And people will say that about translation sometimes when they don't actually know the language that it's been translated from. They haven't consulted the original text. And I often have wondered about that over the years, like, what does this person mean exactly when he says, I love that translation of Dante, or I love that translation of Homer or Virgil. And that's where the difference between the mathematical, mechanical, what we might be tempted to call objective translation, and the difference between that and the translation where the personality of the translator does emerge, because it is a new, in the case of, say, Homer or Virgil, work of poetry that's being produced, or it is a new sentence, it is a new work of art that's being produced. But at the same time, we want it to be a faithful work of art, just in the same way that we want a book review, to get its audience excited about reading the book itself. That's what we want a translation to do. We want the audience to feel like, yes, I understand what this author is getting at, but now I'm just on fire more than ever with an eagerness to get in touch with the author directly. And I think that's the best outcome that we're always striving for when we're teaching young people. Because ultimately, as parents as well, we're trying to point our children toward the basis for our own authority. Just as when we're in the classroom as teachers, we're doing the same thing with our students.
I love that. I like the idea of the translator, especially in my admissions work. I guess it's important to make sure, that the translators are going to have their gloss on the original text, but we got to make sure that we speak the same language before we jump into this project together. Brilliant. This book is just so full of citations to a great many things. In the end, this very difficult historical moment, I think you show beautifully, Matthew, how incompatible it is with Thomas's understanding of parental authority, and then you tie that into some more contemporary, more modern church documents, and just on the importance of freedom, which is also very important to us here at the school. What would Aquinas say, or how would you speak to the following question, which is, at some point, children do leave the womb, and so how does that evolution happen? I mean, at what point does the will and the right to exercise the will kind of transfer to this child?
That's a really fascinating question, and I think that there are resources in a particular modern thinker. I'm going to give you a Thomist answer, I hope that's okay.
Always.
For those listeners who may not know, that means of the school of Thomas Aquinas. But Alistair MacIntyre has a wonderful book called Dependent Rational Animals. I don't know if you've heard of this book, but it's worth taking a look at, especially if you're an educator, because MacIntyre argues that there are virtues of dependence that every independent practical reasoner needs. Independent practical reasoners is his fancy word for, well, growing up, becoming, as you just talked about, Rich, someone who has exercising their practical will, their practical reason to seek and implement what is good for them in a particular circumstance, right? This is what we hope for our children. And to not only do that in a selfish way, but to do that, right, to determine what is good, better, and best in all different circumstances, with an eye toward the greater community, right, in their church and their home and their neighborhood and the stranger. MacIntyre argues that even at that stage of independent practical reasoning, like that you have reached, Rich, or that Lionel has reached, that I hope I myself have reached also, that we are always and at all times still extremely dependent on other people, including people who are our teachers, our mentors, our friends, and our neighbors. Why? Because MacIntyre argues that we're vulnerable. We have certain vulnerabilities as human beings. We could, at any given time, God forbid, be in a car accident and then become dependent. Or we could have an illness strike us, as we learned during COVID, and suddenly become so dependent on the care of another person. So even though we seem like we kind of get to a point where the bird leaves the nest, so to speak, we are always human animals made in the image of God that require the care of other people, and that require the friendship, the guidance, the care, even when we become elderly. Think of the time when we become elderly, where we're so dependent. So I would say that what it means then is to become people who truly are aware of that radical dependence, and yet at the same time how that important gift of practical reasoning is embedded in the communities that we're a part of. The short way to say it is that we have to be part of communities that are virtuous, that can help continually enhance our own virtue.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, in a certain sense, it's like we are very directly provide a spiritual womb of sorts for our younger children. But then as we grow up, as our kids grow up, we all grow up together, don't we? Our kids make us grow up, but we're all sort of part of this extended spiritual womb, as it were, that you just more and more you kind of lift your child into his own participation in this community. It's a beautiful way to put it. I'll check out that MacIntyre book. It's interesting. I think the end of this is fascinating because Edgardo would go on to become Father Pio Maria Mortara.
Yes.
Holy smokes. Plot twist.
Right. We didn't even talk about that part of the story, but this is also part of the, both the interesting part of it, but also the painful part of it is that Pius would, Father Pio Mortara would go on to view his own vocation as that of conversion of his fellow Jewish members of his family and others. And so from the Jewish community's perspective, the story not only begins in a painful way, but also is a tense story as it unfolds as well. Your listeners may not realize that there's a movie about this case that was made by the Italian filmmaker Marco Bellocchio. It's called Kidnapped, and you could watch it for instance, it's on Amazon Prime. The film is difficult to watch, but I think it's important to watch. I think some of the Catholic characters, the Dominicans, are portrayed in a way that's like a little bit kind of, they kind of look like sinister bad guys sometimes. And I think that takes away from the fact that they were just doing what they were supposed to do, like a lot of us do during our jobs. The rules were the rules and you follow the rules. So I don't think they were, as sinister and plotting as they're depicted in the movie. But the movie does depict, I think, the emotion, the raw emotion, the difficulty of the family, their experience of such a grave injustice. And so I think it's important to watch. Yeah. And then perhaps also go and buy our book.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing for it to progress in this way. And I think that you're right to point out the difficulty for the Jewish community of that outcome, because it in a certain sense, it's like part of the problem. A huge part of the problem is obviously you're depriving these parents of their child, which is goodness gracious. But then if you overlay on that, maybe an understanding that, hey, perhaps this is part of the intent all along, is to almost bring members of one community into another, and then they become evangelists, as it were, in a difficult way to the community where they've come from. I can imagine that would be a source of unbelievable pain, rightfully felt. I'm glad you pointed out the film. My last question is just kind of relates to the why today. It's an interesting time to be writing this book, and perhaps the movie had something to do with that. I doubt it. 2023 has probably been on your mind for a long time. But why today, and what can we take as parents and primary educators, as educators who are trying to translate what the parents want for their sons to their sons? Why'd you write the book today? What can we take from it?
Thank you. I wrote the book because I was invited by an academic to give a talk in response to the what was an ongoing controversy in the United States. A few have defended the idea and the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara as what should have been done, what needed to be done. And the argument is that, well, there were spiritual principles to follow there, and that the salvation of the child is the utmost concern, and that justifies the violation of the natural rights of the parents. So I actually engaged in this debate because I was invited to speak about it at Providence College in Rhode Island. And it was when I was invited to speak at that event that it caused me, Rich, to dive into the story. And I remember being on the plane on an airplane when I first read of the account from the court testimony and the documents about the child being removed. And I was very emotionally moved by it at the beginning. I tried to make my academic investigations as objective as possible, but I have to admit that when I first heard of the case, it was a heartbreaker. And it probably was because I had a young child of my own. I couldn't help but imagine what it would be like for somebody to come to the door and say, I have to take your child from you. I think perhaps that's one of the things we can take from the story, is to be open to stepping into the shoes of another, especially with regard to injustices. Sometimes we can see things from different lights when we do that. And sometimes we can even see our own tradition in a new light, and perhaps even find resources for repairing and advancing our own tradition. And I think that's what Lionel has helped me do in this project. It's what we've done together, I think, is to look for resources within the Catholic tradition in these documents that actually help our community become more virtuous to the degree that we engage the truth and reflect upon how to mend injustice.
It's beautiful. Lionel, any other insights? I mean, what drew you into the project, aside from the fact that it seems like you guys have a great collaboration, a good working relationship, but what from an academic perspective, what drew you into this?
Well, yeah, when we first started talking about it, I can't remember if it was an email or a phone call or whatever. I remember being on the phone with Matthew at one point, and I decided to take a look at so where he found this document. It used to be called the Secret Archives, and a few years ago it's been renamed to the Apostolic Archive, which is a way less cool, less Indiana Jones kind of name. But just that, that moment of Matthew's in Rome and he's in this library and he looks at this document, and then he says, hey, take a look at this. And I take a look at it, and it's, you've got a handwritten manuscript that has never been transcribed, has never been edited, let alone translated. It's just fun when you're looking at a manuscript that hasn't been treated before, because there's no like, you can't just jump onto Google or whatever large language model solves all of your problems in life whenever you run into a difficult part, right? Nobody's done it yet, and so that was a lot of fun. But also just all the twists and turns of the story, like, even I know how the story ends. I just rereading. I was just rereading the part. Matthew's presentation of the actual arrest and when the police come to the house just yesterday, I think it was, and all the twists and turns that the story takes, because even knowing how it ends, Salomone, his father, he's gonna get it done, and I'm thinking, like, if I'm in that situation, I'm gonna get it done. I'm gonna win.
Yeah.
He doesn't win. But then, down the road, Edgardo becomes a priest, and, he goes on a speaking tour in America to talk about this too. It's just, like, Charles Dickens could not make this story up.
Yeah.
It's really just, it's one of these moments when history is more exciting, as exciting as real life.
Yeah, totally. And it just makes you grateful that that God is God, and He is, just watching and taking all the twists and turns that we weave into this human story, and finds ways to lead us in some way, shape, or form back to Him. So it's just a fascinating, painful story, and one that I do think that resonates with us right now. It's an interesting time with education in the United States and in Europe, right? In some places where homeschooling is not permitted, but we have these questions, and we've had these questions for the past couple of decades about where the authority of the parent ends, where the authority of the state kind of begins with regard to parenting, and some very difficult choices and decisions. This is also a time, it seems to be, of opening up additional opportunities for federal funding, state funding of schools, and that's good in some respects, I suppose, but also comes laden with some challenges. The whole digital landscape is fascinating. What it's like to raise a child now, to provide that spiritual womb where there are other forces that are very, very easily introduced into it. So a lot for us to think about. I love the kind of the tripartite, the political, the philosophical, but bringing this really wonderful theological treatment into this topic of parental rights and duties is very helpful and important, I think, now, and in a very special way, in a unique way. So my thanks to you both for the work, for the time, and for this conversation. I appreciate it very much. Congratulations, Matthew, on the work, and Dr. Yaceczko on your translation. Just really, I just had this vision of you with a whip on your side, and like the Indiana Jones hat, deep underground St. Peter's by the Scavi, kind of like fighting the rats to get to this manuscript, Lionel. It's awesome. Heights guy through and through.
The Vatican Archives is actually quite nice and impressive, and I can assure you, I didn't see any rats when I was there. But
I'm
maybe
sure.
there's a part. Maybe you've watched The Da Vinci Code too many times or something.
That's right.
The bathrooms have probably automatic water faucets, just like bathrooms anywhere else.
I love it. Well, it's a good thing. Is Father Ron Gillis was quoted a couple episodes ago as saying that the truth is never a problem. So good to have it housed in these beautiful spaces where wonderful guys like you can go and explore it and share it with the rest of us. So thanks for doing that. Congratulations on the book, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Rich.
Thanks, Rich.
That's it for this week, folks. Thank you so much for listening. To learn more about our guests or to find a link to their book, visit the Heights Forum, heightsforum.org. Click on the show notes for this episode, and you'll see all that and so very much more. While you're there, you will also learn more, if you like, about the Teaching Essentials Workshop. We do have a couple of more spots open. I do mean a couple. I think this is going to be a great success. We got folks flying in from all over the country, so do consider joining us. This is a week-long teaching conference for teaching men, a workshop really. It's a smaller group, roundtable, a lot of seminar discussion. Should be really wonderful. So it's not too late to jump in, but almost. Register at heightsforum.org/events. While you're there, you can also learn more about the upcoming Convivium, which is going to be wonderful. This is in November. It's our annual conference for teaching men. And this will be probably 2.5 days here on campus, offering friendship, dialogue, study, and recreation for teaching men and for those considering a career in education. We'll be featuring, of course, our headmaster who speaks annually, but also this year, Dr. Arthur Brooks, good friend of the Heights, and so very much more. So to learn more about how to attend, how perhaps to be a contributor to the event as a speaker, and a whole lot more stuff, visit heightsforum.org, click on the event tab, and you can learn more about Convivium. Finally, you can also support this effort financially. None of this happens without you, so please do consider doing that. You keep our mission going here at the Heights on campus in Potomac, and you allow us to spread this mission, this emphasis on boys' education, on mentoring throughout the United States and the world. We cannot do it without you. We also could not do it without the incredible support of the Forum team, George Martin, who makes all of these web things and podcasts and all the rest of it beautiful, interesting, and engaging. Mary McGiffin, producer of the podcast, Con Megan, Nate Gaudiano. Appreciate the entire team. So thank you all for a great academic year as we launch into the summer. Thank you for your support, and we'll talk to you next week. Live, tide of